The Dragon Age franchise has consistently been one of the most widely beloved and fiercely followed gaming franchises for as long as it has existed, and a huge part of that has been the incredible world building that the series has always been known for. Across 3 games over the course of the last decade and a half, the Dragon Age series has touted some of the most compelling epic fantasy lore and storytelling we've seen in games, which is why it's no surprise that there's as much excitement surrounding the upcoming Dragon Age the Veilguard and its story as there is. BioWare has said that the upcoming 4th mainline Dragon Age installment is going to be a perfectly suitable jumping in point, even for someone who has never played a Dragon Age game before, which, given the fact that it has been a decade since the series' last game, doesn't really come as a massive surprise here. Even so, it's fair to assume that there's going to be plenty of connective tissue tying the Veilguard to its predecessors, as far as the overarching story and background lore are concerned. To that end, ahead of the action RPG's approaching launch, we're going to go over the full story of the entire Dragon Age franchise in a series of recaps, with this first one focusing on the franchise's seminal 2009 debut. So without further ado then, let's dive into the full story of Dragon Age Origins. If there's one thing that BioWare is known for, it's building massive worlds that are brimming with dense, rich lore that they can then use to tell fascinating tales, and Dragon Age Origins is no different in that regard. Given how crucial its lore is to the story, then before we dive into the proper game's immediate narrative, we're going first to put some pieces in place and go over some necessary background information. So let's start with the basics. The Dragon Age franchise takes place in the fantasy world of Thedas, which is occupied by many different races, primarily in the form of humans, elves, dwarves, and Qunari. Dragon Age Origins specifically is set in the nation of Faldon, meanwhile, which continues to face persisting significant troubles in the form of a recurring phenomenon known as the blight. And what is the blight specifically? Deep in the deep roads, an underground network of highways originally built by the dwarves, where creatures numbering in numbers beyond counting, dark and twisted and corrupted, known as the Darkspawn, now reside. The origins of the Darkspawn are unknown, with different factions and people having different versions of different stories. But one thing that is known for sure is that the Darkspawn are perhaps the greatest threat faced by the people of Faldon and Thedas. Every few centuries, the Darkspawn find a leader in the form of an archdemon, and under the leadership of the archdemon, the Darkspawn swarm out from the deep roads and onto the surface, advancing with speed and strength and ferocity, with their goal being to wipe out all those who stand in their path and spread their corruption everywhere. That is what a blight is. Thedas has faced 4 blights up to this point, but by the time Dragon Age Origins is about to kick off, it's on the verge of facing its 5th. The Darkspawn, led by the archdemon known as Arthemiel, are gathering, and Faldon is bracing itself to face their advance. Thankfully, Thedas doesn't stand completely undefended. For centuries, an order known as the Grey Wardens have stood guard against the blight. Comprised of elite soldiers who are specially trained to deal with the Darkspawn, the Grey Wardens are Thedas' mightiest shield in the face of the blight. But though the blight is clearly the biggest crisis being faced by all of Thedas as far as Faldon itself is concerned, there are other troubles afoot as well, with the many different factions of the game's world having no shortage of conflicting interests. Take, for instance, the Circle of Magi, a group that is essentially the authority on mages and all things magic. Why is that so? Well, because in the Dragon Age universe, the only way for mages to use magic is to tap into the otherworldly realm known as the Fade, an unconscious realm of spirits and unknown entities. Channeling magic through the Fade requires incredible precision and attention, and even the slightest lapse can cause a mage to become possessed by one of the many demons that reside within the Fade, which, as you might imagine, can spell disastrous consequences for not only the mage, but pretty much anyone and everyone around them. As such, magic is heavily regulated, with the Chantry overseeing the aforementioned Circle of Magi, and ensuring that it keeps an eye on anyone who comes in contact with the Fade. There are, of course, those who choose to not report their magical abilities to the Chantry, for fear of being ostracized, something that is very common with mages in Thedas. But that is very much illegal. Enforcing the legality of that is the Order of the Templars, soldiers affiliated with the Chantry who hunt abominations and mages who fall outside of the Circle of Magi. Dragon Age Origins lets players choose one of 6 backgrounds for the character they want to play as, and as you may have gathered from the lore dump that we have kicked this recap off with, that choice ends up having quite an impact on your story, particularly the way it begins. You can play as a human noble, a city elf, often treated as second-class citizens by humans everywhere, a Dalish elf, a group that tends to lead a nomadic lifestyle, an apprentice magi at the Circle of Magi, a dwarven commander, or a dwarven noble. Based on which of the 6 origins you pick, you'll get a different beginning to the game, while your origin will also impact the story to varying degrees, including how characters will treat you and behave with you. Either way, the game's prologue ends the same way, with the player character being recruited by Duncan, the commander of the Grey Wardens in Ferelden, who is on the lookout for new recruits for the Order in order to face the oncoming threat of the Blight. From there, Duncan and the protagonist go to the ruined keep of Ostagar, where Ferelden's forces have gathered to meet the Darkspawn horde. Duncan meets with Kaelin, the king of Ferelden, and Terran Loghain mac Tyr, a great and powerful lord who also happens to be the queen's father and the king's father-in-law. Together, the 3 leaders plan their army's attack on the Darkspawn forces, hoping to stop the 5th Blight before it can threaten all of Thedas. Before that, however, the initiation of the new Grey Warden recruit takes place. The protagonist takes part in a ritual known as the Joining, alongside other recruits, and it is revealed that to become a Grey Warden, one must ingest Darkspawn blood, which in turn allows you to sense the Darkspawn, if you can survive, that is. The player character happens to be the only survivor of the Joining and becomes a full Grey Warden. From that point forward, the protagonist is referred to as the Warden, which is what we'll be doing as well. After the Joining, Ferelden's armies prepare to march against the Darkspawn, and King Kaelin and Duncan inform the Warden of their task. Together with fellow Grey Warden Alistair, the Warden has to reach the top of a tower overlooking the battlefield and light a beacon, while the King, his forces, and the Grey Wardens engage the Darkspawn horde. Once that beacon is lit, it will signal Loghain and his forces to make their move and attack the Darkspawn in their flank. When the battle begins, the Warden and Alistair do succeed in lighting the beacon, but Loghain turns out to be a traitor. As soon as he sees the signal, he orders his forces to retreat, as a result of which the Grey Wardens fighting on the front line are defeated by the Darkspawn, while Duncan and King Kaelin are also killed. As the battle turns sour, Alistair and the Warden are overwhelmed by their foes as well. The 2 of them do manage to survive, however, thanks to help from unexpected allies. When the Warden and Alistair come to, they find themselves in a hut deep within the forest, rescued by a woman named Flemeth, who it turns out is the legendary Witch of the Woods, a powerful shape-shifting mage who lives in isolation with her daughter, Morrigan. Having found the Warden and Alistair after the battle and helped them return to health, she helps them formulate their next steps, to use ancient treaties that the Grey Wardens once signed with different factions of Ferelden to try and gather support to fight back against the Blight. Flemeth also sends Morrigan with them, hoping that her daughter's own magical abilities will be of use to them, and for other reasons that we'll get into in a bit here. In addition to Morrigan and Alistair, Dragon Age Origins allows players to recruit and befriend several other core companion characters. There's Liliana, a Chantry sister who also happens to be a formidable spy, Oghren, who is a brash and loud dwarven warrior, Sten, a proud and stoic Qunari soldier, Zevran, an elven assassin who belongs to the shadowy assassin group known as the Antevin Crows, Wynn, a mage in the Ferelden Circle of Magi, a Mabari warhound that players can name themselves, and Shale, a stone golem who is added to the game as a DLC character. Back to the story at hand. In Ferelden's capital city of Denerim, Loghain has returned and is taking the next steps in his evil master plan to grab power and take the throne for his own. His informal queen, Nora, his daughter, of her husband's death and publicly blames the Grey Wardens for the king's death and the defeat of Ferelden's forces against the Darkspawn at Ostagar, before going on in order to capture and execute any surviving members of the Order. He then declares himself the regent and takes control of Ferelden, which sparks protests from other nobles, many of whom also don't believe his claims about how the king died. That of course sparks a civil war, which, as you guess, is the last thing that Ferelden needs on the eve of another blight. The Warden and his companions, however, continue their quest to find allies. Using the Grey Wardens as ancient treaties, they travel all over Ferelden and are able to successfully recruit the aid of the dwarven troops of the Kingdom of Orzammar, the Circle of Magi, and the Dalish Elves. Another key ally they recruit is Arl Aemon of Redcliffe, the older of the late king's uncles, and a powerful and respected nobleman. Arl Aemon was also the man who raised Alistair, who, it turns out, is the child of the King Marek, the former king of Ferelden and father of the recently deceased Kaelin. That, interestingly enough, means that Alistair also has a claim to the throne, which of course is currently unoccupied. Eventually, it also comes to light that Queen Nora is being effectively held captive by her father, who doesn't trust that his daughter will support him in his power grab, especially since many suspect him to have orchestrated her husband's death. On top of that, however, likely unbeknownst to Loghain, one of his fiercest supporters, Rendon Howe, is also planning on killing Nora, and then pinning the blame on Arl Aemon, effectively eliminating 2 of Loghain's biggest competitors with one move. The Warden, however, is able to successfully rescue the Queen and get her to safety. After the Warden and their companions have recruited enough allies and forged enough alliances, the plan is for Arl Aemon to summon a Landsmeet, a gathering of all the Ferelden's nobility that will decide the future of the nation, where the Earl intends to use Alistair's nobility to propose him as the next king of Ferelden. Honora, meanwhile, wants the throne to pass on to her, and ultimately, the Warden ends up playing a significant role in exactly how things shake out. Based on the players' actions, Alistair can take the throne alone, Honora can take it alone, Alistair and Honora can agree to a betrothal and take the throne together, or one of the two can agree to a betrothal with a human noble, including potentially the Warden if that's what you're playing as and if you agree to the betrothal, and ascend to the throne that way. Alright, so let's rewind a little bit though, because there's a lot else that happens at the Landsmeet. Loghain tries his best to convince everyone of his lies, while the Warden tries their best to prove Loghain wrong. Ultimately, words don't do much to resolve the matter, and the Landsmeet culminates in a trial by combat. Either the Warden or a different champion engage Loghain in a one-on-one duel, which can end either with Loghain's execution or with his surrender. The latter option opens up a further choice. Do you simply spare his life, or do you make him join the Grey Wardens and help them in their fight against the Darkspawn? The latter choice leads Alistair massively disapproving and leaving the Grey Wardens. Either way, Loghain is dealt with and the Ferelden Civil War is now firmly in everyone's rearview mirror, which just leaves the little matter of the encroaching Darkspawn horde. It is at this point it is revealed, courtesy of Riodoran, a veteran Grey Warden from the nation of Orlais, exactly how a blight is to be ended. Riordan involves the Warden and their companions that when an Archdemon is killed, its essence passes on to the nearest Darkspawn, which, in a nutshell, means they're immortal. But, you see, this is where the Grey Wardens and their unique connection to the Darkspawn comes in. As per Riordan, if a Grey Warden is the one to strike the killing blow against an Archdemon, they are the one who absorbs the Archdemon's essence, thus killing both. On the eve of the battle, Morrigan also comes to the Warden with more crucial information, finally revealing exactly why her mother rescued the Warden and Alistair and asked Morrigan to accompany them. She tells the Warden about an ancient blood magic ritual with which when the Archdemon is slain, its essence will pass on, since it will be carrying the Warden's Darkspawn taint too. That will mean that the Warden will continue to live while the Archdemon's spirit is active, which is what all Archdemons used to do before they were corrupted by the Darkspawn. Morrigan tells the Warden she intends to raise it in isolation, away from everyone and everything, including the Warden. If the Warden doesn't agree to her proposal, she leaves the party. Here we finally arrive at the last battle, which takes place in the city of Denerim, after the Darkspawn's forces take it by surprise. With the help of the allies gathered over the course of the game, the Warden and their forces are able to hold their own. Riordan perishes in the conflict, however, which leaves the Warden to deal with the Archdemon, which they are able to do. How that particular fight ends obviously depends on a number of different choices, particularly the aforementioned key decision that you make with Morrigan, but ultimately the Archdemon is dead and the Darkspawn forces retreat, ending the 5th Blight. Dragon Age Origins wraps up with an epilogue that reveals the fate of many characters and groups based on players' choices. From whether or not the protagonist survives, to which of your companions are still loyal to you, to even who rules Ferelden and what the nation's future looks like, there's plenty that changes based on your decisions over the course of the game. And that does it for our recap of Dragon Age Origins. When we return for part 2 of our full series recap, we will be talking about Dragon Age 2.
For many, Dragon Age 2 is the black sheep of the Dragon Age series, but though the action RPG is undoubtedly a deeply flawed game, it's also not without strengths of its own. Narratively, for instance, there's plenty about Dragon Age 2 that catches the eye, with the game serving as a crucial chapter in the larger overarching story of the fantasy franchise. Dragon Age is, of course, also set to make its long-awaited comeback not long from now, with its 4th installment, the Veilguard, set to launch after a decade of anticipation. Ahead of its release, we've been looking back at the full story of the series so far, having gone over the events covered in its debut outing, Dragon Age Origins, in great detail in part of our series recap. Here, we're going to shift our focus to its sequel, Dragon Age 2, and tell the story of Hawke, the Ferelden refugee who goes on to become known as the Champion of Kirkwall. As is traditional for the Dragon Age franchise, Dragon Age 2 doesn't directly pick up from where the first game left off, instead largely choosing to do its own thing with a new protagonist, a new setting, and a new set of characters. There is, nonetheless, still plenty of connective tissue between the first two games, both in terms of some key returning characters, as well as overarching narrative elements and through lines that run through both stories. When Dragon Age 2 begins, though the threat of the Blight and the Darkspawn Horde have been dealt with, the land of Thetis is dealing with other major problems, chief among them being a brutal civil war that has broken out between mages and Templars all over the land. Of course, the two factions have always been at odds owing to their very existence and the primary purpose they serve, with one of the chief reasons for the Templars' order existence is to hunt and deal with any mages who fall outside of the Chantry's purview. But how exactly is it that both of these groups, who otherwise used to operate under the Chantry's supervision, are now going at it against each other and wreaking havoc all over Thetis? Few know the exact details of how the conflict between the two broke out, but for Cassandra Pentagast, figuring that out is her key mission. As a Seeker of the Chantry, these Seekers are a policing force for the Chantry, in case you're wondering. Her mission is to find a way to put a stop to the ongoing war between mages and Templars, and if she's to do that, she first needs to understand exactly how the conflict even started. And though there's still much to learn, the one thing that she does know for sure is that a famed soldier named Hawk, who is also known to many as the Champion of Kirkwall, was at the heart of the conflict's very beginning. Holding Hawk responsible for the current state of the world, Cassandra knows that they have to be found, which is a search that leads her to one of Hawk's closest accomplices, a dwarf named Varric. Taken captive by Cassandra and interrogated under duress, Varric's tales about Hawk's rise to power in Kirkwall and the role they played in the widespread eruption of violence between mages and Templars serves as the framing device for the entirety of Dragon Age 2. Varric's tale, however, starts at the very beginning, before Hawk even arrives in the city of Kirkwall, which serves as the game's primary setting. Before Kirkwall, Hawk's family themselves, their mother Leandra, a sister named Bethany, and a brother named Carver lived in a village of Lothering, a place that Dragon Age Origin fans will be very familiar with. The village was, of course, overrun by the Darkspawn Horde in that game, and Dragon Age 2 picks up around that point, with Hawk and their family freeing from Lothering shortly after the Darkspawn win a devastating victory at Ostagar. The Hawk family's destination is Kirkwall, a city-state in the free marches that Hawk's mother Leandra is originally from, and where the family plans to seek refuge with her brother Gamblin, who lives in their estate there. Their flight from Faldon doesn't go exactly as they would hope, however. One of Hawk's siblings, Bethany or Carver, is killed, which is decided based on which class you pick for Hawk in the beginning, with an ogre taking them out, but just as it looks like the group is about to be overrun by a Darkspawn horde, they're rescued in the nick of time by what looks like a fearsome dragon at first, but turns out to be the shape-shifting witch of the woods, Flemeth. After dealing with the Darkspawn, Flemeth tells Hawk that she will help their party reach Kirkwall if they agree to deliver an amulet to a specific Dalish elf in the free marches. Hawk, who doesn't exactly have an abundance of options, agrees. However, when Hawk and co do arrive at Kirkwall, they find that their problems are far from over. For starters, getting into the city itself proves complicated, with Hawk having to enter the service of one of two groups to secure the money needed to get into Kirkwall, a debt that they will then have to pay off over the coming year. On top of that, when they do manage to get into the city and meet Hawk's uncle Gamblin, he tells them that the family's estate is lost, now in possession of Tevinter slavers. Afterwards, they have no choice but to take residence with Gamblin in Kirkwall's Lowtown. From here, we jump forward to the beginning of the first of Dragon Age 2's 3 acts, which kicks off a year after the end of its prologue. Before we get started with that, however, we're first going to pause here and briefly go over the companion characters that players recruit and befriend over the course of Dragon Age 2. Companions are, after all, a crucial part of any Dragon Age or BioWare experience, and Dragon Age 2 touts a pretty large cast of them. There is, of course, Varric, whom we've already spoken of, as well as whichever one of Hawk's siblings, Bethany or Carver, survives the prologue. Then there's Anders, a mage and former Grey Warden who is determined to protect his fellow mages from the tyranny of the Templars in Kirkwall. Aveline, a warrior who is a fellow refugee in Kirkwall and goes on to rise through the ranks of the city guard. And Meryl, a shy and soft-spoken Dalish elf who uses blood magic. They're joined by optional recruitable companion characters in the form of Isabella, a smuggler and pirate captain who is stranded in Kirkwall, Fenris, an elf and a former slave who is hunting his old master, and Sebastian Vale, a brother of the Chantry looking to avenge his murdered family and available only with the Exiled Prince DLC. As you might imagine, each character goes on to play a major role throughout the course of the game. Back to the story at hand, though. A year has passed since Hawke and his family's arrival in Kirkwall, and by this point in time, the blight in Faldon has also ended, which means we're now past the events of Dragon Age Origins. Hawke has managed to work off his debt that they had to take on in order to be able to enter the city, but even so, things could certainly still be much better, which means a golden opportunity is something that they're always on the lookout for. And luckily enough, an opportunity just happens to present itself when Hawke crosses paths with Varric Tethras and his brother Bertrand. The two dwarves, it turns out, are planning a treasure hunting excursion into the Deep Roads, with little fear of running into Darkspawn this soon after the blight has been dealt with. Hawke, of course, wants in, and though it takes some work and some convincing, including meeting with and recruiting Anders due to his knowledge of the Deep Roads as a former Grey Warden, they do manage to convince the Dwarven brothers to enlist them. Before they head into the Deep Roads, however, Hawke also heads to a Dalish camp close to Kirkwall to find its keeper, Merithari, to whom they need to hand over the amulet they received from Flemeth in order to hold up their end of the agreement with Shapeshifting Witch. That leads them to participating in a ritual for the amulet performed by the Blood Mage Merrill. Yes, this happens to be her introduction, following which it's revealed that the amulet carried a piece of Flemeth's soul, thanks to which she's able to essentially instantly flee to its location and be reborn here, preventing a death that she had supposedly feared may have been coming for her, perhaps even at the hands of Morrigan and the hero of Ferelden, aka the protagonist of Dragon Age Origins. Why exactly did she fear that? What does she plan to do now that she's used her amulet? All of these questions are remained unanswered in BioWare's relentless pursuit of maintaining as much mystery around Flemeth's character as possible. Eventually, it's time for the expedition into the Deep Roads, which unfortunately doesn't exactly go as planned. Initially, Darkspawn's presence is relatively light, though their troubles begin where they happen to find a certain artifact deep inside some ruins. The artifact, turns out, is made of red irium, which is a highly potent and raw form of the mineral irium, which can be used to thin the veil and come into contact with the Fade, and in turn, the spirits and demons within. That, as you might imagine, often leads to a possession and even abominations. Bertrand is corrupted by the red irium artifact, following which he betrays Hawke and Varric, locking them, leaving them behind and keeping the artifact for himself. Hawke and Varric head deeper into the Deep Roads, and after much trials and tribulations are able to not only find another way out, but also happen to chance upon a pile of treasures of their own. So at least the expedition wasn't a complete bust. Then again, it's not a complete victory. For starters, if Hawke's surviving siblings came along, they end up contracting the Darkspawn taint, following which they either have to be mercy killed or Anders can take them with him so they can join the Grey Wardens, which is the only way the taint can be cured. If the siblings did not come along, their fates end up being very different and change based on which sibling is alive. If Bethany, who is a mage, is the one who's still alive while Hawke is away on the expedition, she gets discovered and conscripted by Kirkwall's Circle of Magi. Meanwhile, if Carver is the one who survived the events of the prologue, he voluntarily joins the Templars while Hawke is away. Here, Varric's tale of the champion of Kirkwall jumps forward by 3 years. Thanks to the treasures Hawke's found in the Deep Roads, they have found fame, notoriety, and influence in the city of Kirkwall, and have also been able to buy back their family's old estate in Hightown, which is where they now live. Meanwhile, with Hawke now in position of a certain level of influence and power, they're also someone the city's higher-ups are very much aware of, and at times even rely on for aid. That, in fact, is how Dragon Age 2's second act kicks off, with Hawke being summoned by Kirkwall's Viscount, who informs them about troubles brewing in the city with a large military contingent of the Qunari. The Viscount tells Hawke that a shipwreck 3 years prior brought the Qunari to Kirkwall, which is where they've stayed since, and in that time have continued to become an increasingly pressing concern for the city's authorities. Their unwillingness to abide by Kirkwall's laws has put the Qunari and the city's people at loggerheads, and it's now gotten to a point where the open aggression of the Qunari are threatening to erupt into outright hostilities, which would be good for absolutely no one. Over the course of Dragon Age 2's second act, tensions between Kirkwall and the Qunari continue to boil, and though Hawke is very much a part of them, initially they have problems of their own to deal with. That's because Act 2 of the game also brings the death of Hawke's mother, Leandra, who dies in a brutal fashion at the hands of a blood mage serial killer, Quentin, who has been preying on women all over the city to recreate and revive a woman he used to love. After Leandra and Quentin are both dead, Hawke also discovers correspondence that suggests that the latter had an accomplice, someone only known as O, who provided Quentin with hidden knowledge on the necromancy ritual that he has been performing with the corpses of the women he killed. Hawke pledges to find out who this O is, but that has to wait. For now, we pivot back to the increasing hostilities between the people of Kirkwall and the Qunari because those hostilities sure have been increasing. It's also revealed that the reason the Qunari are refusing to leave Kirkwall because they're looking for a relic that is important to them, which it turns out was stolen by Isabella, Hawke's pirate captain companion. Things with the Qunari eventually come to a head when they attack the city, execute the Viscount, and attempt to take control. They are, however, stopped by the forces of Kirkwall led by Hawke. In the aftermath, after the Qunari have been driven away and the city has been saved, Hawke is declared the champion of Kirkwall. But of course, the story isn't over yet. We now enter the final leg of Varric's story about Hawke, and Act 3 of Dragon Age 2. Another 3 years has passed since Hawke saved the city from the Qunari, but tensions in Kirkwall are still high, if for entirely different reasons. After the Viscount's death, a new Viscount wasn't put in place, with Knight Commander Meredith of the Templars instead taking control of the city and turning it into a tyrannical police state, where she and her soldiers relentlessly hunt mages outside of the Circle without mercy. The Circle itself, meanwhile, is also facing extreme oppression from the Templars, because mages, after all, are always the enemy in their eyes, thanks to their attunement to the Fade, whether they're from the Circle or not. The open aggression of the Templars hasn't gone without protest, however, because First Enchanter Orsino, who is the leader of the Circle of Magi in Kirkwall, has been openly critical of Knight Commander Meredith's actions, with tensions between the Templars and mages continuing to grow. Things continue to heat up over the course of Act 3 before finally exploding, quite literally, when Hawke's former Grey Warden companion Anders decides to take matters into his own hands. A mage who has grown increasingly disillusioned with the way the people of his kind have been treated and oppressed by the Chantry and the Templars, Anders decides to take extreme measures in order to fight back, triggering the explosion that destroys the entirety of Kirkwall's Chantry and killing everyone inside. Unsurprisingly, Knight Commander Meredith doesn't take kindly to that act. In response, she calls for the right of annulment, which in a nutshell means the death of every single mage in Kirkwall's Circle. The Circle, of course, responds with violence. Hawke is forced to make a decision at that point, and it's one with consequences. Choose to side with the Templars, and you could lose the loyalty of Merrill, while siding with the mages could see both Avalyn and Fenris deciding to abandon the party. You can, of course, also decide the fate of Anders, who can either be killed or spared. Back to the story at hand, however, as Templars and mages battle each other all over Kirkwall, it is once again Hawke who comes to the rescue. For starters, Orsino is killed after he uses a spell that turns him into a hideous monstrosity. It's also implied that Orsino was the O who enabled the necromancer Quentin to go on the killing spree that killed Hawke's mother a few years ago. Meanwhile, later, it's also revealed that Meredith has been corrupted by a Red Irium artifact, the very same artifact that Bertrand found in the Deep Road several years prior that he, it turns out, then went on to sell to Meredith. Much of Meredith's bloodthirstiness and violent behavior may have been caused by the Red Irium corruption, and when the Templars under her command learn that, they decide not to try and impede on Hawke in their efforts to stop the Knight Commander. Those efforts end in a climactic duel between Hawke and Meredith, which in turn ends with the latter's death. There ends the tale that Varric has been recounting to Cassandra, and we jump back to the present, at which point the fallout of the events in Kirkwall is revealed. After the conflict between the Templars and the mages in the city, the Circle of Magi was disbanded all over Thedas. The Templars broke away from the Chantry, and the Circle and the Templars are now locked in a sweeping conflict. Varric tells Cassandra that Hawke and the party drifted apart after everything that happened, with Hawke leaving Kirkwall and their whereabouts currently being unknown, even to Varric. Cassandra, meanwhile, now agrees that it wasn't Hawke who was at fault for the beginning of the ongoing war between Templars and mages, but Knight Commander Meredith and Anders. Of course, Hawke's story isn't over. The Dragon Age 2 protagonist returns in the series' third installment, Dragon Age Inquisition. Before we close off this part of our recap of the entire Dragon Age series, we do need to talk briefly about the Dragon Age 2 DLC named Legacy, where Hawke and co. fight against an ancient Tevinter Magister who was corrupted by the Darkspawn taint long ago. He was in fact one of the very first Darkspawn to ever come into existence. Named Corypheus, this is a major antagonistic player in the events of the next game. Legacy ends with Corypheus breaking free of a Grey Warden prison, unbeknownst to Hawke, only to return not long afterward in Dragon Age Inquisition to wreak untold havoc. But that's a story for later.
Well, here we are. In the lead up to Dragon Age the Veilguard's upcoming launch, we've been going over the story of the entire Dragon Age franchise bit by bit, and after having covered the events of both Origins and Dragon Age 2, we arrive at the final installment of our series recap. In this third and final part of our full Dragon Age recap, we're going to dive into the events of Dragon Age Inquisition as well as its Trespasser expansion, before briefly touching on and setting up the upcoming fourth installment of BioWare's fantasy RPG series. So without any further ado, then let's get started. When Dragon Age 2 ended, we left Thedas in a state of war yet again, with the Mages and the Templars at each other's throats. The Circle of Magi has disbanded everywhere, while the Templars have broken away from the Chantry, with conflict having enveloped the entire world. Right before the events of Dragon Age Inquisition, however, this conflict is brought to a temporary halt when Justinia, the leader of the Chantry, calls for a peacekeeping conclave at the village of Haven in Ferelden. This is where the game begins, though as you may have guessed, things do not go as planned. A massive explosion destroys the entirety of the conclave, killing everyone present, with the only survivor being the protagonist. The explosion also happens to leave a hole in the veil, which is the name given to the metaphysical boundary that separates the real world from the Fade, the ethereal realm of spirits and demons. Said to have been saved by Justinia, who sacrificed herself in her final act to save the protagonist's life, the protagonist somehow managed to survive this carnage when no one else did. And though they are looked at by the surviving leaders of the Chantry in Cassandra Pentagast and Leliana with some suspicion, it soon turns out that the explosion has left them uniquely positioned to be of tremendous help. You see, the massive hole in the veil, dubbed the Breach by the people of Thedas, has also brought with it rifts throughout the land, through which all manner of nightmares are leaking out from the Fade. And it turns out the only way to close the rifts, and in turn the breach, is with a mysterious and magical mark that has appeared on the protagonist's arm, known as the Anchor. Oh, and speaking of the breach, what exactly was it that caused that explosion at Haven in the first place? Well, that would be Dragon Age Inquisition's main antagonist, Corypheus. We briefly mentioned him in our recap of Dragon Age 2, with that game's Legacy DLC showcasing a showdown between protagonist Hawk and Corypheus. Though the fight ends with Hawk's victory and Corypheus' presumed death, it turns out that, much like Darkspawn archdemons, Corypheus has figured out how to transfer his existence across bodies, effectively allowing him to become immortal. So who exactly is Corypheus anyway? As it turns out, he is one of the original Darkspawn. Once a magister of the Tevinter Imperium, his lust for power led him to enter the Golden City, centuries upon centuries ago, in hopes of grabbing power for himself. And though he failed to do so, he did end up becoming corrupted as one of the Darkspawn, predating even the first Blight. Now, freed and back out in the world, Corypheus has even and every intention of once again attempting to enter the Fade and grab that power. Thankfully, what's left of the leadership of Thedas has a plan in place to shore up defenses and fight back against Corypheus. Fulfilling Justinia's final commands before her death, Cassandra and Leliana established the Inquisition, an ancient order that, in its current rendition, is tasked with sealing the breach and fighting against the threat of Corypheus. The player character is conscripted into the Inquisition as well, given the importance of the Anchor, the magical mark on their arm that can be used to close rifts. As is the case in any Dragon Age game, or really any BioWare game for that matter, the protagonist is joined by a diverse cast of companion characters that you recruit and get to know better throughout the course of the game. Some of these companions are familiar faces, with Varric returning as a party member, and Cassandra joining you on the front lines. Plenty, meanwhile, are fresh faces, but go on to play crucial roles. There's Solus, who claims to be an elven mage who has lived in isolation his entire life, having spent years exploring the Fade and having become deeply and unusually attuned with it. As fans know all too well, he's a particularly important character, though more on him in a bit. Several other companions join you on your adventures. There's the gruff Grey Warden soldier Blackwall, the Iron Bull a Kunari mercenary leading his own company, and a member of the organization known as Ben Hasrath. The elven mage Sarah, who also belongs to an enigmatic secret society called Friends of Red Jenny. Dorian Pavus, who is a mage from the Tevinter Imperium, Vivian, a mage and a personal advisor to the Empress of Orlais, and Cole, who is a mysterious ghost-like entity with unknown origins. The early hours of Dragon Age Inquisition see the Herald traveling to different locations in order to enlist new allies for the Inquisition, which, as you might imagine, leads to plenty of offshoot quests, side quests, branching narrative arcs, and what have you. Eventually, with the help of either a faction of rebel mages or Templars, the Herald is able to close the breach, though that only proves to be a prelude to much larger problems. The Inquisition's base in the village of Haven is attacked by Corypheus, who leads a massive army and is riding atop a dragon himself. As the village evacuates, the Herald engages Corypheus in a duel who, it turns out, has business with the Herald. You see, Corypheus wants to use the anchor on the Herald's arm because it is the only way for him to enter the Fade. His goal then is to remove the anchor from the Herald's body so that he can use it for himself, and the way to do that is through the Orb of Destruction, which is a powerful and ancient elven artifact in Corypheus' possession. It turns out, however, that things won't quite pan out the way the Darkspawn mage had hoped for, because the anchor has become permanently affixed to the Herald's arm. Ultimately, in a desperate effort to turn the tides of the battle, the Herald uses a trebuchet to cause an avalanche, which in turn buries the entire village of Haven and much of Corypheus' army. The Inquisition and the people of the village, meanwhile, are able to escape. In the aftermath, with Solas's help, the Inquisition is able to find the ancient fortress of Skyhold deep in the mountains, claiming it as the organization's new base of operations. Additionally, the Herald is officially named the leader of the Inquisition, and from that point forward, widely becomes known as the Inquisitor. That's where the first act of Dragon Age Inquisition's story ends, though it doesn't take too long for things to begin heating up again. The Inquisition's next main goal is to unravel the mysteries of Grey Warden disappearances, and in this next leg of the story, the game reveals that Grey Warden soldiers all over Thedas are being secretly manipulated by Corypheus, and aiding the Inquisition in this particular venture is a very familiar ally. None other than Hawke, the champion of Kirkwall and the protagonist of Dragon Age 2, shows up at Skyhold, and after an introduction facilitated by Varric, becomes pivotal to the Inquisition's efforts to free the Grey Wardens from Corypheus' grasp. Hawke is also joined by a Grey Warden companion who, depending on a number of factors, can either be one of two familiar characters from Dragon Age Origins in Alistair O'Logain, or John Mark Stroud, who first appeared in Dragon Age 2. Eventually, during a battle against Grey Wardens under Corypheus' control, the Inquisitor enters the Fade, where they learn how they were saved by Justinia before she died at the explosion at Haven, and how they acquired the anchor through pure happenstance. The mark, you see, was meant to go to Corypheus as part of a ritual that the Darkspawn was performing, though clearly things did not go as planned. Crucially, in the Fade, the Inquisitor, accompanied by both Hawke and their Grey Warden ally, has to take on a formidable foe in a nightmare, though in the aftermath of the fight, the Inquisitor is forced to decide whether to leave behind and sacrifice either Hawke or their Grey Warden ally so that they can buy the other two some time to escape from the Fade. Afterwards, with the Grey Warden situation dealt with, the Inquisitor decides whether to exile the Order and enlist them to the Inquisition's cause. The survivor between Hawke or the Grey Warden ally, meanwhile, departs from Skyhold, heading off to debrief the leader of the Grey Wardens. The Inquisition, meanwhile, continues to get involved in significant history-shaping events all over the land. In Orlais, for instance, the organization gets involved in a brewing civil war that sees the Inquisitor bringing relative peace back to the kingdom by settling the conflict for the throne, following which Orlais also throws its military might behind the Inquisition's cause. This section also sees the reintroduction of everyone's favorite shape-shifting witch, Morrigan, who unsurprisingly has an important role to play in this story. Eventually, the Inquisition comes to learn, courtesy of none other than Morrigan, that Corypheus intends to use an ancient elven artifact known as the Temple of Mithril. This artifact, known as an Alluvian, will allow Corypheus to travel to the Fade and reopen the breach, though when the Inquisition arrives at the Temple of Mithril, they discover that Corypheus is actually looking for something known as the Well of Sorrows, which is a different ancient elven artifact. So what exactly is it, however? The well, you see, is sort of an endless repository of knowledge and powers tied to the legendary elven entity Mythil, who was one of the original elven deities from ages and ages ago. Whoever drinks from the well will gain access to those powers. Depending on what the player decides, either the Inquisitor or Morrigan drinks from the well, following which the group escapes from Corypheus. Plenty of significant details are revealed at this point. For starters, some lingering remains of Mythil, it turns out, continue to exist even now, and they exist in a vessel who is, interestingly enough, none other than Flemeth, Morrigan's mother. Meanwhile, Morrigan also finally figures out how to kill Corypheus for good. The key, she learns, is his dragon, which, if killed, will put a stop to Corypheus' ability to transfer his soul to a different body upon being killed, thus eliminating his immortality. To help the good guys fight against their foe on a relatively level playing field, depending on who drank from the Well of Souls, either Morrigan gains the ability to shapeshift into a high dragon, or the Inquisitor gains the ability to summon a magical elemental high dragon known as the Guardian of Mythal. As you may have guessed, Dragon Age Inquisition's climax comes next, with the Inquisition's forces and all the allies you've enlisted coming together to take on Corypheus' horde. The battle proves a thorough success. The breach is permanently sealed. Corypheus' dragon is killed, and Corypheus himself is permanently slain, thus bringing an end to his terrifying machinations. As it comes to a close, however, Dragon Age Inquisition reveals that Corypheus was far from Thetis' biggest worries. It's revealed in the game's final moments that Solas isn't actually a random elven mage who's been living in isolation his entire life, but is actually Fen'Haral, aka the Dreadwolf, alongside the previously mentioned Mythal. Long ago, back when the world was ruled by elves, and there was nothing separating the Fade and the real world, when Evarnius betrayed and killed Mythal, Fen'Haral, disillusioned with their corruption, sealed them off in the Fade, hoping to free the world of their corruption and their evil ways. And thus, the Veil was created, permanently separating the Fade from the real world. Doing so knocked Fen'Haral, or Solas, for literally centuries upon centuries, but when he awoke, he was devastated by the consequences of what he had done. With their connections to the Fade almost completely cut off thanks to the Veil, the elves had become second-class citizens, at best, all over Thetis, losing their identity, their culture, and pretty much everything about them. At the time, Solas decided that he would undo his mistake, which meant having to tear down the Veil and let the real world and the Fade merge once again. As you might imagine, that would lead to horrific, terrifying consequences for pretty much the entire world, but in the aftermath, Solas would be able to recreate the world as he saw fit. Of course, after reawakening from his long slumber, Solas did not have the energy that he required to enact his plan, which was why he ensured that the Orb of Destruction, which it's revealed was his own, would wound up in Corypheus' possession, who would be powerful enough to use it to breach the Veil. He hadn't considered that the Darkspawn would have figured out how to make himself immortal though, which led to some complications, to put it mildly. A post-credit scene at the end of the base game shows Solas meeting with Flemeth, and the meeting ends with him absorbing her powers, which means he has now absorbed Mythal as well, for whom the witch had been a vessel. Meanwhile, the Trespasser DLC is also another crucial piece of the puzzle, since it's here that we learn about Solas' true past as one of the Avernurus, his role in the creation of the Veil, and the fact that he now intends to tear it down. Meanwhile, at the end of this DLC, the Inquisitor, who has, thanks to Solas, also lost the arm that carried the anchor by now, also either disbands the Inquisition or turns it into a peacekeeping organization. Which, of course, is what leads up to Dragon Age: The Veilguard. The upcoming action RPG will see both new and familiar heroes rising up all over Thetis and coming together to put a stop to Solas' plans. The game is set a decade after Inquisition and Trespasser, which means the Dreadwolf has had plenty of time to prepare, though how exactly his plan to destroy the Veil will pan out does remain to be seen. So, what are your thoughts on this? Go ahead and share them in the comments below. And if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel and enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon to get new video updates. We upload every day and would really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.